China stands accused of inhumane treatment of Africans during the coronavirus outbreak. That includes forceful testing, quarantine, and evictions. So is this just another form of racism, or is Beijing just trying to curb the pandemic? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. They are China's key trading partners, but some African leaders have been angered over Beijing's reported discrimination against their citizens and demanded answers from the Chinese government over reports Africans are being targeted because of fears they could spread coronavirus. A recent rise in COVID-19 infections in China has been linked to people from abroad. The Chinese government is worried there could be a second wave and has stepped up its scrutiny of foreigners. African students and expatriates have reportedly been evicted from their homes, tested for coronavirus several times, and are being shunned in public. The incidents have sparked a diplomatic row with the African Union, African governments, and the United States. And Chinese ambassadors have been summoned by African officials in different countries. In a rare open critique of Beijing, the Speaker of Nigeria's House of Representatives tweeted a video of himself pressing its envoy on the reported ill treatment of Africans. He was heard saying, "It's almost undiplomatic the way I'm talking, but it's because I'm upset about what's going on." The Speaker of the House asked the diplomats to explain scenes that have gone viral on social media platforms. The United States consulate in Guangzhou has advised African Americans to stop traveling to the city. In a statement, it said this: police ordered bars and restaurants not to serve clients who appear to be of African origin. Local officials launched a round of mandatory tests for COVID-19, followed by mandatory self-quarantine for anyone with African contacts, regardless of recent travel history. African Americans have also reported that some businesses and hotels refuse to do business with them. China says its policy towards Africa hasn't changed and denies discrimination against what it calls its African brothers. This is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson had to say about accusations made by the U.S.
Under the current situation where the international community urgently needs to work together and fight against the epidemic, it is irresponsible and immoral for the U.S. side to make those remarks and sow discord. We urge the U.S. to focus on containing the epidemic at home. Its attempt to drive a wedge between China and Africa's relationship will never succeed. In response to the recent African side's concerns regarding their citizens in Guangdong province, the Guangdong authorities have already conducted an investigation and taken a series of new measures. We believe that the issue will be properly solved through the joint efforts of China and Africa.
Let's bring in our guest now from Beijing, Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. From Wuhan is Gabriella Dillon, a medical student from Uganda, and from Hong Kong, Keith Richburg, Director of the University of Hong Kong's Journalism and Media Studies Center. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it very much. I want to start with you, Gabriella. So you're in Wuhan, obviously, which is where this pandemic started. Just what is daily life like there now? What are the restrictions that you are still dealing with?
Life is better. Life is back to Wuhan. So far, the locals, it's mostly the Chinese people who are able to go to the supermarkets and the banks and the shops. The foreigners, not so much, because we haven't yet been cleared for. We haven't yet got our health certificates and the health codes that we need in order to go to the banks and the supermarkets and all the other places. Otherwise, we can get permission to leave our homes and walk around in the streets, which is better than nothing. So that's how life is now.
So as far as getting this permission, these tests and screenings that are needed for you to kind of go wherever you want, it's dealt differently with Chinese as opposed to foreigners. It's a different type of setup.
It's the same setup, but it hasn't yet included the foreigners yet, because the Chinese right now are able to do it, but we can't do it. So in other words, it's like they haven't yet found a way for us to go out there as foreigners.
Is the fear, or maybe I don't know if that's too strong of a word, maybe not, the fear or concern of a second wave of this happening, Is that palpable there? Is that something that you all really feel there, Gabriella?
Definitely. Second wave is something that we're all worried. Everyone's taking the necessary precautions. People are still using the masks. People are staying indoors. Not so many people are on the streets, but once in a while, people moving around. And like today, I actually asked for permission to go out and take a walk. And most shops were open, and there were a lot of Chinese out there. But definitely, everyone is still taking the necessary precautions to keep safe. But people, the Chinese, still staying indoors. So yeah, people are a bit worried about the second wave.
So Victor, I'm going to come to you now. These reports, these videos, I understand that the Chinese government is by and large saying, that there is not any sort of campaign of discrimination. But what do you see about what is happening there? These videos are what they are.
Now, first of all, China-African relations are very, very solid. And for some politicians in the United States to accuse China of practicing racial discrimination against Africans is really a fallacy. We all know how poorly and terribly have been the racial discriminations practiced by the United States against African Americans, and we call for a stop to such racial discrimination. Secondly, now in China,
So
we
hold
are
on,
still
Victor,
very much in the middle of the fight against
Victor, one second.
coronavirus.
Victor, one moment before we get to point two, which I will let you get to. Let's go back to point one. Yes, there is racism in the United States. I am an African American. That is separate and apart from what I asked you about what is going on in China.
That is exactly why I would say the U.S. politicians can do a better job in fighting to contain the spread of coronavirus in the United States, rather than, for example, falsely accusing China of practicing racial discrimination against Africans.
Victor,
we all treat African brothers and sisters as they are. We have high respect for the Africans.
Victor, let me try again.
By such false accusation.
Victor, let me try again. I'm not talking about what's happening in the U.S. I am talking about what is happening in China. I am talking about the personal accounts from people who, you could see the signs that people are holding up at McDonald's, basically telling Black people, you can't come here. This is real. That is not the United States. I don't want to hear about the United States. I really am asking you, can you deny this? You really can't.
No, first of all, China is still in the middle of this fight against coronavirus.
That is true.
Lots of things have changed. We are not in a normal situation. We have massive amount of quarantine, lockdown, constant taking of temperatures, constant checking of your IDs, your passports, for example. But all this has a purpose. That is to cut off the spread of the coronavirus. And anyone should abide by the rules and the regulations. Many of them are very alienating. Some of them are very intrusive into privacy, as we normally understand. And I would say everyone, Chinese or non-Chinese, Asians, Americans, Europeans, Africans, etc. in this fight against coronavirus, we are all in the same boat. So let's listen to what the government authorities have to say. Let's always carry our ID card. Let's always be willing to have our temperatures taken. And if they want to take our testing, to the testing, because you are doing this not only for your own good, you are doing this for the good of the whole community.
Okay, Victor.
So I would urge everyone in China to abide by the rules and regulations.
Your point is well taken. Absolutely. China is really in a fight right now to make sure that this doesn't come back. And it is a very intrusive situation for a lot of people all over the world, and obviously particularly in China. So I don't think anyone would have a quibble with what you're saying. It just seems that perhaps there's an extra level of measures that are happening to other people. Actually, I'm going to go to Keith now, Victor. I'll come back to you in a moment. Keith, so what Victor is saying, yes, it's absolutely true. We're in a pandemic. Things are going to be a little different now. But it is clear that it seems certain people are being targeted for an extra level of scrutiny. Is that how you see this?
It's absolutely how I see that. And with respect, Victor, what I'm seeing here is that China made a decision. Xi Jinping made a decision that this was contained around late March. It was contained in China. After that, you started seeing no provinces reporting that many new cases, but they claimed that all the new cases of this virus were so-called imported cases. Now, let's unpack that a little bit. These so-called imported cases are actually Chinese citizens returning to China from abroad. But the way it's been interpreted by many people is that these are foreigners bringing in the disease. And so therefore, foreign diplomats have been told not to come to Beijing. Foreigners in Beijing have been under an increased level of scrutiny, and foreigners, particularly in Guangzhou, and especially African foreigners, have been subjected to this higher level of scrutiny, suspicion, anger, and discrimination in Guangzhou. There was indeed a case where I think several Nigerians went outside of quarantine, went to a restaurant and infected people. Since that happened in Guangzhou, there has been widespread discrimination.
I think
In restaurants, they've been kicked out of their apartments.
Keith, just a moment. We had a bit of a technical issue, but Gabriella also wanted to get in, so just stand by. Go ahead, Gabriella.
Okay, I want to add on what he said. 80% of the imported new cases were because of the Chinese that came in, but also the other 20% was from the foreigners. So we can't really totally rule out that the foreigners didn't contribute to the imported cases. So it all went down like the foreigners were being tested for corona as well. So it's not only the Chinese that brought the new cases, but also the foreigners.
Gabriella,
and that's why they were being tested. That's the point.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, no, Gabriella, I wanted to ask you, what is it like just as a Black woman living in Wuhan, even before all this happened? Just what does your day-to-day life feel like to you?
Honestly, you always feel like a stranger because you're looked at weird when you get on the subway. No one wants to sit next to you, or someone will cover their nose. So you always, but you get used to it. But it's strange. It's a strange feeling. You can't get used to it. It's not home. But the way it's going down now, being discriminated right now, it feels worse than it was before. So as a Black woman,
go ahead.
I feel them, and they don't really. It's like they do it knowingly, you know.
So, Keith, I want to ask about that. The feeling that Gabriella is describing. So often, people. Something that a government is doing gets attributed to the people. It's not always the same thing. You know, there's things that the Chinese government can do that isn't necessarily what you feel from Chinese people, like out in the community, or Asian people, depending on what country you're in. What has your experience been, Keith? It's not all the same.
It's not all the same. My experience is that on the official level that Victor is talking about, China wants to have good relationships with Africa, with African countries. This goes all the way back to Mao Zedong, who wanted to have fraternal relations with African countries. China today, modern China, is investing a lot in Africa. They built the African Union headquarters. They're building soccer stadiums. They built the road from Nairobi to Mombasa. They're doing a lot.
They're also sending masks and medical equipment there.
They're sending masks and medical equipment. So on an official level, China has great relations with Africa. They want good relations with Africa. On a person-to-person level, a lot of Chinese, many, I'm not saying 100%, but many still discriminate against Africans. They see Africans as inferior. If a Black person like myself, who's from the United States and speaks English, wants to go teach English in China, we would be turned away because we're not white. They think an English teacher should be white. They're discriminated against in many different ways. African students are discriminated against. They talk about it. Africans in general are seen as criminals. I've gone to Guangzhou, to the area that they call Little Africa or Chocolate City. Africans have told me that they're constantly stopped and harassed for their ID and for their passports. It's very hard for them to rent places. So on a person-to-person level, there is a lot of discrimination. When you bring this topic up to Chinese officials, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry, Victor, but the answer is always, yes, but you have discrimination in the United States too. So it's always kind of a whataboutism. What about your discrimination against the Blacks in the United States? It's always that answer without addressing the fact that, for example, they had a New Year's Eve presentation a couple of years ago for New Year's Eve where they did skits with Chinese wearing blackface and dressed as animals and dressed as monkeys. And they put this on the air. on CCTV, and they thought this was okay. So they have a kind of an unconscious discrimination when they don't realize it.
Victor, I want to bring you back in the conversation, and your point is well taken. Yes, there is racism in the U.S., and unfortunately, something that is happening now is that many Asian Americans are being targeted because of their ignorance about COVID-19, and that's an awful thing, and it absolutely should not be happening. However, the fact that there seems to be, at least, and we were hearing it from Gabriella and Keith, there is the same type of, at least some level of discrimination happening in China too. How can you not acknowledge that?
No, first of all, in the Chinese history, there has been never any institutionalized discrimination based on color. That's very, very important. And this sets China apart from many other countries which have institutionalized injustices based on color. Secondly, I disagree with the other panelists. I think China is a big country. We have 1.4 billion people. Of course, different people have different opinions, of course, but I think China as a whole condemns discrimination of all kinds, especially discrimination based on racial discrimination based on color. And in China,
so let me ask, hold on.
People around me, we do not distinguish people based on their color.
Okay,
I think color is an important part of human being, and they should all be respected.
Victor, everybody sees color, so let's just put that to the side. But let me ask you this. If you're saying that perhaps this is happening, but you're saying that this is not something that is institutionalized, that if that's the case and the Chinese government isn't okay with it, why don't they put their foot down to make it clear that this is not acceptable and actually do something about it?
No, I think China is one of the best countries in the world in terms of respecting Africans, for example, or people of color from all parts of the world, both as a government, as a society at large, and on a person-to-person basis. I commingle with lots of Africans, actually, in Beijing. Some of them work for CRI, the radio station. Some of them work at CGTN. We are very proud of our personal relations, and I do treat them, and they treat me as brothers and sisters. And I think I'm very typical of people in China who do see these people as equals, rather than, for example, having this false sense of superiority or inferiority. I think people of all colors, we are equal under God.
Keith, the people that are experiencing this, and Victor makes a good point. Obviously, China is a very populous country. We're not trying to say that everybody is this way. Absolutely not. But these people's experiences are real. So for people that are experiencing this, what options, what recourse do they have?
Look, very little. Look, when the virus struck in Wuhan, when people like Gabrielle were stuck there from Uganda, America took in planes to take their nationals out. Other countries chartered planes to take their nationals out. A lot of African countries, many of them poorer, did not charter planes to take their nationals out, and so they were kind of stuck there, and so they didn't really have a whole lot of recourse. A lot of them, I don't know about Gabrielle's situation, but a lot of students went there because they were given scholarships or they were invited in by the Chinese government. They were invited in to learn Chinese or to learn other skills. But when push came to shove, and I'm afraid this has happened in the United States as well, xenophobia has come to the top. This virus has caused a spate of xenophobia around the world, whether it's Thailand, the United States, Europe. People are closing borders and looking at other people with suspicion. Even Australia has closed its borders, saying we don't want any outsiders coming in. Chinese are reacting kind of the same way, except they've got this huge population of Africans living in Guangzhou who are now being looked at with suspicion. They're being looked at as virus carriers. They're being looked at as someone to be avoided because they might not be as clean. They might not be following the same rules as we are. And so they're someone to be avoided. And yes, that is happening in the United States against Asians, not only Chinese. All Asians are being discriminated against. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing xenophobia popping up everywhere, I'm afraid, because of this virus. Borders are closing.
Do you think that this could have, and you talked about China has a big footprint in Africa, and we've outlined that. Do you think that this has the potential to have to sour diplomatic relations in any way, or is China's footprint just too big?
I think it will sour diplomatic relations. I think, look, there's a huge population of Chinese in Africa. As this story gets out there and gets legs, seeing how Africans are being treated in China, you might see a backlash against many of those hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Chinese living in Africa. There has already been a lot of backlash against Chinese in Africa. A lot of Africans are starting to say that China's big economic footprint in China is benefiting China more than it's benefiting Africa. A lot of countries are going into a lot of debt to pay for some of these big projects. The Mombasa to Nairobi Railroad, for example, could end up putting Kenya into a lot of debt that they can't afford. A lot of these countries are starting to say, hold on a second, we're not getting the jobs from these projects because they're employing Chinese to come over and do the job. So there's been a lot of criticism of China's footprint in Africa. And then when Africans start seeing how Africans are being treated in China, yes, you could have a very big backlash. This could set back China's Africa policy by many years.
Victor, your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think so. I think let's face the realities. We are all in this fight against coronavirus, and the coronavirus does not discriminate against races or countries or ethnicities. So this is the common lesson we all need to bear in mind. Let's get united to fight against the coronavirus, and let's abide by the rules of every government, every country as they are, because the strength of any defense line is actually determined by the weakest point. So if you have exceptions, for example, if you allow any group of people to disobey the rules and regulations, then the whole line of defense collapses. You have to look at the overall majority's interest. So I would not care whether it is Americans, Europeans, Japanese, Asians, for example, or Chinese, for example, they all need to abide by the rules. And if you hear the horrible stories which have happened to many overseas Chinese coming back because they do not abide by the rules, they are kicked out of the country straight away. They are Australians, they are other countries' citizens, etc. They are not black people, they are not African people. So that's one point I want to make. The second point is that what China has been doing in Africa is definitely for the good and the benefit of the African people. Let's continue to do this. Let every country involved, Americans or European countries, if they want to do the same as what China has been doing, the beneficiary will be the Africans.
Okay.
More roads are needed in Africa rather than less roads.
Okay.
That's the key point.
Victor, Gabriela has been wanting to get in on this point. Go ahead, Gabriela.
Yeah, you're saying what they're doing to the Africans is what should be done by every country. But according to what I know, most of the Africans went in for quarantine for 14 days. And when the 14 days were over, they gave them another 14 days. And they didn't do this for the Chinese people. Why? I feel like that's not something, if we're all equal and at the same level, then we should all be going through the same processes. You see what I'm saying? I feel like it's not the same thing when we are being given extra and extra things, that we're being tested twice, we're quarantined twice. It's nonsense.
So Gabriela, what do you see your future as there?
Here, I'm hoping like in a month or so, we're able to access all these things. Because right now we actually have to apply for the health code, but to get that, they need to monitor you for 14 days to make sure that you're not sick, so that they can be able to let you go out in the public and use all the banks and the supermarkets. Otherwise, I'm hoping to graduate next year and go back home, you know. I've lived here for 5 years and it has been fun, but it's good to go back home as well.
Well, hopefully you will graduate and then we can have you back on and call you Dr. Gabriela. Thank you to all of our guests, Victor Gao, Gabriela Dillon, and Keith Richburg. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the program again anytime. Go to our website, Aljazeera.com. You can also join the discussion on our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.